Good afternoon. This is the Terrorism Risk Insurance Program 2023 data call webinar for captive insurer reporting. So we have quite a few of you here on the call today. I hope that's why you're here. I am Richard Ift. I am joined by Sherry Roulette and not yet, but soon, Annette Burris. All of us from FIO are on the call today. In addition, Mike McCauley of ISO, who is directing the collection and aggregation of the data for Treasury through the portal operated by ISO, is on, and also Aaron Brandenburg of the NAIC, which is coordinating terrorism risk data collection on behalf of the state regulators. So the purpose of the data call, it is required by Section 111 of the 2015 TRIP Reauthorization Act, which is now Section 104H1 of TRIA. It is designed to provide Treasury with a data set that it will use to periodically analyze, among other things, the effectiveness of the program and the competitiveness of small insurers in the terrorism risk insurance marketplace. State regulators have determined to collect similar information for the regulatory purposes addressed by state regulators with respect to insurers under their supervision. Treasury and state regulators are continuing to coordinate in this effort with a consolidated approach that allows reporting insurers to provide the same data set to Treasury through ISO and state regulators through a portal operated by New York State, and thereby satisfy their production obligations to both through the provision of the same data to each. The regulatory due date for the annual data call is May 15th, which was set in light of the Federal Insurance Office's statutory obligation to provide a report to Congress concerning the program each year on June 30th. Again, because of that reporting deadline on our part, we are unable to extend the time for insurers responding to the data call beyond May 15th. So we do encourage you, please get your submissions in by then. We have a very tight window to get all the information aggregated and anonymized and presented to us in time for us to do what we need to do. As has been in the case in prior years, we are doing separate webinars for each of the 4 reporting templates. For small insurers, non-small insurers, alien surplus lines insurers, and captive insurers. This, of course, is the webinar addressing captive insurers, which are any insurers participating in the TRIP program that are regulated under state law as a captive insurer. This includes both domestic U.S. captives as well as any offshore captives that may be licensed in at least one U.S. jurisdiction and who are writing terrorism risk insurance. Offshore captives not licensed in any U.S. jurisdiction do not participate in TRIP. Any captive that writes any terrorism risk insurance subject to TRIP must report. To the extent the captive writes in the TRIP eligible lines of insurance but does not extend any terrorism risk insurance backstopped by the program, such a captive has no obligation to report. There is no reporting exemption, however, for captives that do not that do write terrorism risk insurance subject to the based upon the amount of premium they write. A captive writing any terrorism risk insurance under TRIP is required to report no matter how much premium it writes. And just to make that, put a fine point on it, in other words, there is a $10 million 2022 direct earned premium reporting exemption threshold for small insurers that does not apply to captive insurers. Reporting is on a group basis. If you are part of a group or otherwise on an individual company basis. The form is the same regardless of the size of the captive. If you happen to be affiliated with a company that is required to report on the non-small or small insurer template. However, you should report the captive experience on that template identifying the captive among the companies reporting. Otherwise, we will be conducting this particular webinar based upon the requirements in the Captive Insurer template. You'll be happy to hear there are no material changes to the reporting forms from those used last year. Last year, there were some changes specifically for captive insurers, as well as for captive insurers that write cyber risk insurance. I will note those again as I go over the worksheets, although there are no changes to those requirements. On the cyber worksheet, there has been a liberalization of certain of the reporting requirements, which I will address when we get there. And there have also been some instruction changes for further clarification, which I will try to note as we go along. There is also a new model loss question for this year, although that question is similar in format to those that have been posed in prior years. Again, remember that reporting is on a group basis, which is how TRIP operates. You will only be reporting solely for an individual company if you are not affiliated with another company writing TRIP eligible lines of business. The process for getting started is pretty simple. You will go to the TRIP reporting website, and so far here, this is actually FIO's website for the program, and we're going to be coming back here, but there is a link here to the TRIP reporting portal. Go ahead, and when you click that, you will come to this site, which indicates that the 2023 data collection is underway. You will see there is a registration form at the bottom. You download that registration form and send it back to ISO, which starts the process. A captive manager is permitted to register and report on behalf of the captive and can do so by submitting a bulk registration listing if it works with multiple captives. The actual reporting, however, once you get the forms together, will ultimately be done on separate forms for each separate captive group or company. Once you get the registration form completed, you will email it back to the address provided, and the point of contact listed on your registration form will receive an email from ISO with a link to a secure portal that will contain your required reporting form. Once you complete the reporting form, you will send it back to ISO through the same secure portal. Although this is a consolidated data form, you will also separately submit your completed reporting form to the New York portal for state reporting purposes. The forms will be provided in Excel format. However, if you prefer to report using a CSV form of report, you can elect for that, and ISO will provide you with specifications that allow you to report in that format instead. And at this point, I would turn it over briefly to Mike McCauley and Aaron Brandenburg just to provide any updates they have on the data call from the standpoint of the portal operators as well as the state regulators. Mike, you want us to get started?
Yeah, absolutely, Richard. There'll be a couple caveats that I will address after my initial status update. For all captives that have registered through Tuesday, every registration has been processed. Therefore, you should have received a secure Verisk message containing your SFTP credentials in order to access the data reporting templates. As it relates to my caveats, this ties into the bulk registrations. Several of you on this call probably have submitted those. Some of you may have received the blank reporting templates already. Just be aware that we are processing the company lists that you submitted as part of the bulk registration, and we do intend to provide the final company number lists in the event that we do need to assign company numbers as part of that process. Any captive that has registered subsequent to Tuesday, those registrations are in process, and you can expect to receive a communication shortly from us. And that will be my update, Richard. Thank you.
Okay. Aaron, turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. As Richard said, since 2018, states and Treasury have worked together on a consolidated data call. So the same data file does need to be submitted in 2 locations, both to the Treasury through their secure file transfer and to the state of New York through their portal. We sent out an email to companies with these instructions and linking to the NEIC's Terrorism Risk Insurance Data Call webpage, but you can also go to that webpage and look at the instructions for the portal and other particulars. We do have an email address out there, triahelp@neic.org. But again, just make sure that you submit the file to the two locations. And if you happen to have a refile or something like that, please reach out to both entities so that we can be sure we both receive the same data sets. Thank you.
Yeah, good point, Aaron. There are, it doesn't happen a lot, but occasionally there will be, as ISO goes through the reconciliation process, there will be identified errors or things that basically need to be corrected. So you may hear back requesting an update or a correction, or at least an explanation as to why things look the way they do. If that leads to the submission of a new submission, please make sure to send it back anywhere you submitted it before, so both to the ISO portal as well as to the state portal. If you are actually licensed to write workers' compensation insurance and you report such information to state regulators, and again, our understanding is some risk retention groups, which get sort of classified here as captives and report on the captive forms, might do this. You should be able to rely upon NCCI, the California WCIRB, and the New York Compensation Insurance Rating Board to report in the workers' compensation fields for those questions, which will then be merged into the data that you otherwise report. However, these entities will not register on your behalf, nor will they provide reinsurance information relating to workers' compensation exposures, which appears on the last worksheet we'll discuss today. So that you certainly need to register and complete at least some of the forms relating to workers' compensation if you write that. In addition, any insurers that provide excess workers' compensation is also subject to TRIP. They would need to provide that information since the rating bureaus do not have that information. Nor do I, of course, have figures applicable to, we do ask for workers' compensation deductible reimbursement policies, and that obviously is not with the rating bureaus either. So although we suspect that reporting by the rating bureaus will actually affect very few companies reporting as captive insurers, if you do fall into that category, please keep that in mind so we can avoid duplicate reporting. Our main suggestion in the data call is please review the instructions, which is in a separate document located on the TRIP website. And Sherry, why don't you go ahead and you could pull up the instruction document in there. There it is. Okay, this is a link on the TRIP or the FIO's TRIP webpage. Both PDF copies of the forms as well as the instructions are there. I mean, please take a look at the instruction form for captive insurers. That form may answer many of the questions you might have, and they're both sort of general comments and summary information, as well as a specific instruction as to each field of information that you have in there. Hopefully that will answer many of the questions you might have. Other sources of information apart from the webinar, you can obtain specific help to a specific question you might have by emailing TRIP section 111data@iso.com. If you send such an email, you will either, one, get a written email response, two, get a call from ISO, or three, get a call from Treasury. Alternatively, and we'll we'll put this in the chat if we haven't yet. We'll put in direct contact information. We're Mike McCauley at ISO, as well as for myself, Sherry Roulette, and Annette Burris at Treasury in the chat. So if you need to contact us directly, please feel free to do that. In addition, we have generated, as we have in past years, a sample answer document, which is on our website. And Sherry, can you click back to the main data collection page? There it is. And yeah, it's right. Yeah, that's sample fact pattern. That it provides some examples on how to report various elements of the data call, at least ones that we think may not be immediately intuitive. It also walks through, and you might find this helpful, how the model loss question should be answered using a particular example, which obviously is a generic example, but I think if you understand how we walk through the reporting for that one, you should be in a position to respond on that one if you have policies that are implicated by the model loss question. Also available on our website, immediately above the sample fact patterns, is a zip code listing, which is actually an Excel file download. It's a zip code listing for the various areas identified on the geographical exposures worksheet, which should be of assistance in completing that worksheet if it's easier for you to basically accumulate information by zip codes as opposed to the descriptions that are otherwise on the template. At this point, we're now going to walk through each individual worksheet within the Captive Insurer template with some explanations as to what we are seeking and suggestions for completing each worksheet. We will then open it up to individual questions, which you can pose by going to the Zoom menu and submit through the chat mechanism. If you send it just directly to Sherry or myself, we'll see it and no one else will. If you feel like sending it to everybody, that's fine too. We'll obviously see that too. So do it however you want to do it, if you feel like remaining anonymous or not. And again, we'll go through as many of those as we note as we go along. And if we don't catch them as we go along, we'll certainly touch on all of them at the end of the prepared remarks. We're going here through PDF versions of the reporting forms, which is what we have loaded onto our website. And they're actually somewhat easier to present in this format than trying to present a live Excel form. Once you register and get your email from ISO with your forms, you will receive live Excel versions of these sheets, which ISO tailors as necessary for each individual company or group based upon the form it should complete, jurisdictional worksheet it will need, etc. As was the case last year, you can also report by providing information in CSV file format, for which ISO will provide specifications upon request if you're in that category. Now, the first sheet on the screen, this is the insurer group affiliations, which is page 1. This is just basically to identify who you are. Again, reporting is on a group basis unless obviously you are a single company. We use NAIC codes for tracking purposes as much as possible. As most captives may not have such a number, if you've participated in this before, you probably know ISO will assign a number to you for tracking purposes. If you have participated in the call before and are aware of the number previously assigned to you by ISO, please use that number. Going over, and you'll see for type of insurer, there are in the real form there is like a drop-down menu which allows you to put in captive or entry for risk retention group, that sort of thing. To ask you to note here your domicile as well. In columns G and H, lines 3 or 4, you will see we request that you identify your total 2021 policyholder surplus. And again, just a quick note, while the data call is focusing on 2022 information for the most part, we do ask a couple questions about the prior year in each data call that is relevant to your trip deductible and how we otherwise evaluate you. So please enter in line 3 here in cell H, your 2021 policyholder surplus in that year. And in line 4, please enter your 2021 trip eligible lines DEP. Regarding that 2021 premium, which is again relevant as the measure of your 2022 deductible, if you reported that figure in last year's call and leave it blank when you submit this back, it will be populated later by ISO when you return the form, so you can rely upon them for that. However, since keep in mind, you do need that number to respond to some of the questions on the reinsurance worksheet in terms of figuring out what your deductible is, so just keep that in mind. If you did not report last year, or if you reported a figure that you now believe to be an error based upon further evaluation, then please enter any new or corrected figure in there. Note, and this may be relevant to some captives given they tend to be a little more fluid and created and uncreated. We have added some clarifications in the instructions this year for insurers that did not have any 2021 trip eligible lines premium that year, and thus might be tempted to enter in the trip in the reinsurance page as to the reinsurance questions that their deductible is 0. Your deductible for trip is never 0. If you didn't have any prior year premium, which is what is typically used to calculate the figure, the program provides for the assessment of a deductible based upon trip eligible lines premium for the year in question. So for example, if you had no 2021 premium, Sherry, are we getting back to the form page? But anyway, the point is, if you didn't have any 2021 premium and are essentially reporting for the first time in this data call, and you're reporting your 2022 experience, there are instructions in the instruction document as to what you would put in that field to reflect what your what it will be characterized as your 2021 premium, but it will also be used to calculate your 2022 deductible. So if you are in that position, just keep that in mind. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to us. And okay, let's go back to the forms page. Second. Oh, here we go. Okay, go next. Go down to the okay. Here we go. The premium worksheet. This is identified by relevant NAIC line or subline. The figures in E, F, and G should add up to figure D. In fact, it's set up the figure D is essentially, or column D is a formula which basically sums what you enter into columns E, F, and G. Column H is a figure for the actual terrorism risk insurance premium charge, and that should be a subset of the total policy earned premium, which is reported in column G for policies in which a premium is charged. When reporting premium, remember also that although terrorism risk insurance program is defined for the most part in terms of NAIC state reporting lines, you cannot follow that in all cases, as there are some significant differences. principally lines 1 and 2.1, 1 and 2.1 allied lines, include both commercial and personal lines coverage, and TRIP only addresses commercial, so any personal lines coverage needs to be excluded. And again, we appreciate that may not be much of an issue for captives that are writing only commercial lines coverage. Also, but probably more significantly, professional liability or E&O coverage is excluded from TRIP, even though it otherwise falls within other liability, which is a covered line, and you'll see that down there at the line 17 figures. The instructions do identify the principal differences between TRIP lines and the NAIC state reporting lines, so if you have any questions on that, you should be able to resolve them there. Premiums should be entered on a direct earned basis by state for calendar year 2022. This means that if you have a policy that started before 2022 or ended after 2022, you will need to include only the premium earned in 2022 for that policy. Premium should be reported on a state basis by the manner in which the captive reports it for state purposes. Thus, for example, if a captive domiciled in Vermont reports all of its premium to Vermont, because a captive is permitted to do that, even though it is insuring risks in multiple states, it can report in this fashion as well for the TRIP data call. As we will discuss later, this can be done for policy exposures as well when we get to that worksheet. However, on the geographic exposures worksheet, which will be addressed near the end, just keep in mind you will need to report there based upon where your insured risks are actually located. Just as a reminder, we did institute changes on the premium worksheet last year by first requiring that you separate out on a line-by-line basis premium written in all lines for deductible reimbursement policies versus all other policies. Previously, we had only requested this for the workers' compensation line, where most of the coverage is written on a deductible reimbursement basis. We are trying to get a better understanding of how captives are writing insurance subject to the program in other lines as well. Second, there is now, and you'll see this is on line 30, so Sherry, if you could go down. Line 30, you'll see there is a question where we ask you to report all of your direct earned premium in non-TRIP eligible lines on an aggregate basis as well. This is to include any premium written by the captive, no matter the type of coverage or where it is placed. Again, we are trying to get a better understanding as to the proportion of risk exposures assumed by captives outside versus inside the program. Though we think the requests here are self-evident, if you have any questions about what we are looking for in connection with these new requests, we are happy to field any questions that you might have. Going down, Sherry, to the next worksheet, standalone terrorism. For comparative purposes, this form asks for information on terrorism risk coverage for both Treasury certified acts coverage as well as other acts of terrorism that are not certified. So essentially, you know, non-certified acts coverage policies. Based upon, this is a pretty straightforward form. It is based on a nationwide, not state reporting basis. The only issue is keep in mind that it's essentially a subset of what gets entered into the prior worksheet as well. Any premium that you report in here for standalone terrorism should be reported in whatever the appropriate line is in the general premium worksheet as well. We're just trying to break out what the standalone terrorism portion is. Okay, let's go to the next worksheet, which is cyber. This is the next worksheet is for cyber risk. There were a number of expanded areas of inquiry introduced for the first time in the 2022 data call. Those categories have not changed for this year, although, and we'll get to it in a minute, we have sort of liberalized some of the reporting requirements in connection with a number of those questions. As in prior years, we are continuing to seek information on both standalone cyber policies, which is column C, as well as to the extent you're issuing it as a cyber endorsement attached to another policy, and that would be put in, figures would be put in column D. You should not provide any information here on non-affirmative or silent cyber coverage, which is where a policy may cover some sort of cyber loss because cyber is not specifically excluded in the policy. Going through the worksheet, lines 3 through 6, 8 to 9, and 18 to 19 request information concerning premium, number of policies, and limits for cyber policies and trip eligible lines of insurance. This information has been requested since Treasury began collecting cyber information in connection with the program, I think back in 2017 or 18 or so. So you should just continue to respond to those questions as you have in the past. Lines 7, 10, and 20 request the same information concerning premium, number of policies, and limits. However, here, that is as applied to cyber policies written in non-trip eligible lines of insurance. While the information is the same as the sort of information we collect or requested in the past, we did expand it last year to policies written in non-trip eligible lines so that we can assess the amount of cyber insurance that is currently not subject to the program. Our understanding is that this will largely be cyber insurance that is currently being coded, characterized, and otherwise reported for state purposes as professional liability insurance, which is subject to an exclusion under TRIA, which I think I mentioned earlier when addressing the premium, the exclusions on the premium worksheet. These questions, assuming you write policies in this fashion, should be answered in the same way as you have already been responding to the questions for policies written in the TRIP eligible lines. Now, last year, for the first time, we did begin requesting certain categories of information which we had never requested before, and specifically directing your attention to lines, Terry, go back up, 12 to 17. We have questions about premium and number of policies allocated by size of policyholder, which last year we measured solely by the number of employees of the policyholder. In lines 21 to 24, so starting at the bottom of the page and continuing on to the next one, we do ask for limits specific to cyber extortion and ransom payments. And finally, lines 25 to 30, loss information specific to cyber extortion and ransom payments. If you participated in the 2022 data call, you may recall that we did provide certain special instructions concerning these new categories, which in some cases reflected that we would be taking a liberal approach on the collection for those insurers who may not have been collecting certain of these elements when we first instituted the requirement. Given that we are now in the second year of this collection, that special instruction has been deleted, and we do expect complete reporting in all of the categories. Now, for one of these categories, however, and again, I'll direct you to lines 12 to 17, premium and number of policies allocated by size of policyholder, we have provided some further options for the reporting. Last year, the reporting required that you make the allocation based upon the number of employees of the policyholders, which we identified in tranches for small, medium, and large size policyholders. This year, based upon certain comments we received, we are also allowing insurers to use revenue categories, which are also specified in the forms and instructions for these small, medium, and large categories. So if you see on here, you can, let's see, line 12, a small policyholder is either 100 or fewer employees or less than 10 million in revenue. Medium is 101 to 500 employees or 10 to 100 million in revenue. Finally, a large policyholder is 501 employees or more than 100 million in revenue. Please note this is an either or election. You cannot use one measure for some of the policyholders you report for and the other measure for other policyholders. And this is something we are going to be tracking. Mike, can you just address briefly what we're doing in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely, Richard. Yeah, as Richard mentioned, it is an either or. So we do need to capture the manner in which you are reporting, whether that be by the number of employees or revenue. So to make it most consistent and easily for reporting entities, what we have done is we've added a parameter to the cyber worksheet file naming convention, which is denoted by a Z. So depending upon whether you report by the number of employees or revenue, you will replace the Z with either an E for number of employees or R for revenue. That information and instructions will be detailed in the SFTP instructions that you receive subsequent to registration. So it's basically designed to limit the burden on the reporting entity's behalf. And that's a quick update there on the instructions, Richard.
And, thanks, Mike. And just so, I mean, obviously we did convince our masters at OMB that we thought it made sense to allow it to be made variable in this fashion. However, we do want to track it to make sure that if it looks like the numbers are out of whack, depending upon which way of reporting is being used, we may need to reassess that. But in any event, just please specify it as Mike just mentioned, and we'll be able to go forward on that basis. We have also added certain, and Sherry, I'm not going to ask you to move over. You can leave it on the worksheet page at this point. We've added certain clarifications in the instructions which specify what fields should reconcile with each other. There aren't any changes in what we've been doing or anything based upon last year. And in fact, most insurers got it correctly. However, just to make sure there were no questions, we have specified further in the instructions how the reporting in various fields should reconcile with each other. So at some point, take a look at the instructions, the cyber form instructions lines C12 to E12, and it will tell you what, the various cells should add up, what cells should add up to what other cells. So please follow that guidance. There are no changes to the questions concerning limits that's specific to cyber extortion and ransom payments. As we explained last year, the distinction we are drawing is between coverage for cyber extortion generally, which obviously can contain policy hit benefits apart for the payment or reimbursement of an actual ransom payment, versus limits for the actual ransom payment. To the extent there is no distinction, that is the same general limit applies to both, then just report the same limit. What we are trying to get at here is if there is a different limit for cyber extortion generally versus the actual ransom payment. The information on this is being requested separately as between policies in TRIP versus non-TRIP eligible lines. Finally, the last category at the end of the worksheet, the loss information specific to cyber extortion and ransomware payments, is requested for all cyber policies combined, whether in TRIP eligible lines or not. Questions seek paid and incurred amounts for cyber extortion generally, and paid amounts for ransom payments, along with the number of claims such ransom payments are associated with. Finally, direct defense amounts for cyber extortion generally, without any effort to segregate that to ransom payments specifically, are sought again on a paid and incurred basis. We can respond to further questions about any of these categories at the end of the prepared remarks, and obviously, if you have any specific questions you want to direct to us individually and contact us separately, feel free to do that as well. Okay, Sherry, next worksheet is the exposures by jurisdiction worksheet. That reduced down a bit. There we go. Okay, this template contains, again, there were some revisions to this template made in the 2022 data call. and I will remind you of those as we go through the sheet. There are no changes applicable to this year. Like the premium sheet, this sheet uses the NAIC reporting lines or sublines and asks that you identify the exposures both covered by and not covered by TRIP. As with the premium worksheet, you are now asked to allocate your responses for each line by deductible reimbursement policies and all other policies, and not just in the workers' compensation line. The point here is to calculate actual total potential exposure under the policy. That is, what is the most you might have to pay under the policy in question. In addition, we also request information on policies where only NBCR risk is insured under the policy. That is, the policies that only insure this risk and do not insure conventional risk exposures as well. So now the sheet requests that you to report in column D for property risk to identify the property limits of terrorism risk insurance, while in column E, it's requested you identify those same limits where NBCR coverage is not entirely excluded. And finally, in column F, policies where the only insurance provided is for NBCR risk. So both column E and column F should presumably be a subset of the figure in column D, or should at least be no larger than the figure in column D. The same questions are found in columns J, K, and L for liability policies. For columns E and K, report that limits are available if the policy fails to exclude any portion of NBCR terrorism risk coverage, even if some exposures, and for example, nuclear, are excluded, so long as coverage for some other exposures and chemical or biological are provided. If the only NBCR coverage provided is on account of so-called fire following laws in certain states, report that no coverage is provided. So, respond as per the provisions of your policy. So in short, the test is whether the policy's terms would provide coverage or not, as we have specified. We do have a question here. The question is, so the limits are only what the policy could pay and not the total insured insured values amount for a direct property policy. Yes, that's right. I mean, if the policy, well, if the policy is unlimited and is basically insures all total insured values, then obviously you would enter that. But if the policy has a limit of, let's say, $10 million, even though the amount of property values that are insured are $100 million, you would include the $10 million. And looks like got another question here. Hold on. And that one is, so exposure basis by jurisdiction, risk retention group issues policies in various states with various insureds purchasing various limits in each state. Do you stack all the limits together, add together of all the policies issued, or use the highest exposure limit issued for a single policy? I think the instruction, I think this isn't, it's in the instructions. We were looking for you, well, one, there are fields, if you're doing this in multiple jurisdictions, you should be, reporting that in multiple jurisdictions. And then basically you report the limit applicable in each jurisdiction. So you do stack them in that case, but there is a general United States worksheet as well for this exposures worksheet. And there you would put in essentially the aggregate unstacked amount. And so I think that hopefully that answers your question. And if not, we can, if the policy, okay, we're getting to the next question is we're going to get to that. Policy canceled 8/1/2022, leave that blank. Is there no exposure as of 12/31/2022? Yes, that's correct. And I'll get to that in a minute. You'll see on the sheet that the information is also requested on policyholder deductibles or self-insured retentions. That should only be reported in connection with primary level policies that reference such a deductible or SIR obligation. These questions now appear in columns G and I for property, and in columns, depending upon whether terrorism risk insurance was obtained or not, and in columns N, M, and O for liability policies. Don't report such obligations in connection with higher level umbrella or excess policies, because that otherwise basically generates a lot of double counting, because you get multiple insurers reporting the same deductible or retention obligations. For purposes of the deductible reimbursement policies, do not report the deductible itself that you are insuring. Again, that would lead to double counting. In these fields, record any amount that the policyholder remains obligated to pay before the captive's agreement to reimburse deductible amounts is triggered. So essentially the deductible of the deductible, if that is what is going on. Otherwise, for policies which contain multiple deductibles or SIRs by jurisdiction, depending upon the property, location, or operation, use the lowest deductible or SIR by state. Similarly, for the United States as a whole, use the lowest policy deductible or SIR. There are some ways, and this is getting the question that was triggered a little earlier. Well, actually, not quite yet. There are some differences in the way exposure information is calculated as compared to premium. As noted above, the exposure metrics can be reported on the appropriate state worksheet in the same manner in which premium is reported. So if your premium is reported to your domicile state, then the exposure should be as well. Otherwise, report the information on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis and enter the relevant limits for each jurisdiction, even if an aggregate limit might cap your exposure across multiple jurisdictions. So for example, if you had $1 million policy covering California and Oregon, you would report $1 million of exposure on both the California and Oregon worksheets, even though there may be an overall limit of $1 million on that policy. On the United States worksheet, you would then provide the total figures for the United States that are not multiplied by the issue of limits applying in multiple jurisdictions. That is, apply here any aggregate limits that might apply, and otherwise respond on a single occurrence limits basis, assuming no aggregates apply. In the example I previously provided, you would report 1 million as the overall United States exposure. For purposes of this worksheet, apply the exposure figures as they existed for policies in force as of 12/31/2022. So if the policy ended, this is the question we got earlier, before 12/31/2022, the exposure will be 0. So this one, we are looking here essentially to get us a good picture for each year. It's a snapshot as of 12/31/2022, so do your reporting based upon that metric. Hey, Sherry, let's move to the next and easiest worksheet, policyholder industry code. Pretty simple one for captives. We're just looking for you to enter the industry type of your principal policyholder by the most applicable NAICS code for that policyholder. That's it. We don't ask for anything more. Next form, and this is for places of worship. This worksheet is on a nationwide basis and seeks information in the general categories of property, liability, and workers' compensation. However, on this worksheet, we are only seeking information on policies written for places of worship. When you are reporting this data, please do your best to only report on coverage related to actual places of worship while excluding any affiliated religious organizations such as hospitals or schools. You will see that we ask you to report this information under a specific industry code. For this worksheet, you can do this under the NAICS reporting system, the SIC reporting system, or ISO class codes. If you can report based upon one of these metrics, please do so. If you cannot, but have some other way in which to extract the information, such as a policyholder name search, please do that. We do not have a category here for unavailable because we are specifically seeking data for places of worship, and this is a direct request for Congress that we obtain this information. So please find some way in which to report your actual or at least estimated information for policyholders within this category. For the workers' compensation elements, again, for those of you that this applies to, NCCI, California WCIRB, and the New York Bureau can provide this information as well, so you don't need to complete those particular fields if you are in that category. Okay, the next worksheet, Sherry. This is the geographic exposures worksheet, which I mentioned earlier. Think of this as requesting the same sort of information that is requested by AM Best on its annual terrorism questionnaire. The geographic descriptions are the same as those used by AM Best. To aid in the reporting, as I noted at the outset, we have also generated a complete list of zip codes for each of the jurisdictions listed on the worksheet. So just as an example, you'll see for Chicago, the description is all zip codes within the 4 counties of Cook, DuPage, Lake, and whatever that one is. I can't actually see that in that level of detail. In the worksheet or the list, the spreadsheet on the website, you can actually get all of those zip codes from there, and it's a live Excel spreadsheet you can download. So if that makes the reporting on that easier for you, you can use that. Otherwise, if that's not working, you can do your best approximation of those areas. Question here: should we report for this if it is just property or workers' compensation deductible reimbursement? I think the instructions on this, yeah, Jeff, you're right. The instructions on this, I think, say for deductible reimbursement policies, you don't have to report that in because essentially we're going to get that reporting from the carrier that actually has the deductible involved. So in any event, so you would this, and I think that is specified in the instructions. So this would be limited to those situations where it's a non-deductible reimbursement policy. Regarding those fields, again, you only need to report for actual. You don't report for the deductible reimbursement categories because that would be duplicative. There is an unknown field here as well. Our intention is that should be very rarely used, and we do expect reporting companies to use their best efforts to identify the actual locations of the relevant exposures. Moving on to the next page of this particular worksheet. So keep going down, Sherry. Yeah. The questions on this page seek aggregations by zip code. So it is all exposures within a particular zip code, and then rank order those as requested. The questions keep scrolling down, Sherry, in lines 49 and 50, by contrast, focus on a particular location as distinguished from all locations within a zip code. So we are looking there to get essentially where your your largest PML is and where it is by zip code. So we're asking you to report that in those particular. Okay, let's go to the next worksheet, and this is the last worksheet, reinsurance. Please answer the questions here based upon your private third-party reinsurance protection. Do not include any intra-company arrangements you may have in place. We ask for information concerning Nat Cat reinsurance for comparative purposes against terrorism risk reinsurance. Note that there are some reinsurance questions here on reinsurance exclusions relating to terrorism apart from domestic foreign questions. This is meant to capture such situations as the exclusion of risks at a particular location or within certain metropolitan areas. We strongly recommend that if you have an individual responsible for your reinsurance program, you forward this worksheet to them for completion, as this will help ensure the accuracy of the data we receive. Now, when responding to this worksheet, we do need for you to enter actual figures for the various fields, and that's particularly in the first column, the response category. If you don't in column C, we understand that in a complex reinsurance program, it may be difficult to pick one number to put in there. However, a response along the lines of see chart or see attached summary, and we do get those, does run the risk of, it doesn't allow us to aggregate the information if we don't get that. So if you have any questions about how to complete this, we're really looking for the best number, then go ahead and put that in. We do have a question here about this, which is, if there is no reinsurance, do we need to complete the form just to answer the deductible question, or say there is no reinsurance or exclusion? Yeah, please go ahead and even if you don't buy any third-party reinsurance, please fill out the questions by putting zeros basically in the appropriate fields, and perhaps in the comment field just note no third-party reinsurance purchased, and that will clue us into what is going on. But if you just leave everything blank without putting in any explanation, we're going to basically be in a posture where we're not exactly sure what you're doing. Sherry, go ahead and move down to the next page of the worksheet, which is the model loss question. What we're looking for you to do here is to figure out the total loss under your policies, which ends up getting put in line 30. It actually auto-populates because there's a formula there, and it's the sum of what's put in lines 31 to 36. And that's going to be in connection with the event that is described in question. And that gets divided between these categories, which are, well, one, your insured's deductible or retention, your net trip deductible, that is net of reinsurance, your reinsured trip deductible, if you have third-party reinsurance that pays part of that deductible. Finally, your claim under trip, which would be 80% of the amount above the policyholder deductible and your own trip deductible. And then lastly, lines 35 and 36 is the 20% balance above the deductible, which is your copay obligation, and that amount is essentially divided between what the captive insurer pays net as well as what it might have through third-party reinsurance. So once you put all those figures in there, those will total up to the total projected loss associated with these policies. So this year's scenario, which focuses on downtown Las Vegas, Nevada, involves a single truck bomb blast at a street location for which we provide GPS coordinates in the scenario description. It should be considered to be a single event or occurrence for trip purposes, meaning that you should only assume the payment of an individual trip deductible and should otherwise apply your policies as if they are responding on a single event or single occurrence basis. This one only respond if you determine that one or more of your policyholders would be exposed to loss arising from the scenario. So if you're not issuing any property insurance or workers' compensation insurance that would respond to an event at this location, you would not need to enter in anything into these fields. Again, the first step, figure out what the total loss based upon what is covered under your policies would be. You need this amount to start calculating the remaining figures. And if you enter the data correctly, then that number will ultimately appear in line 30. Again, policyholder deductible retention only include amounts indicated as payable by your policy holder as a precondition to payments under your own policy. If you are at excess levels above other insurers, such that your obligations are triggered by the exhaustion of underlying coverage, enter 0 here. If you put some amount, here to reflect that retention obligation or deductible of the policyholder, that gets back to the double counting issue. Line 32, the net loss within the deductible. Again, the amount of loss you will incur within your trip deductible that is not covered by private reinsurance. Line 33, private reinsurance covering some amount of your trip deductible. And again, line 34, that's the claim under trip, which is essentially the 80% figure of which is the total loss figure, less the policyholder obligation amounts in line 31 and less the deductible amounts in lines 32 and 33. Lines 35 and 36, again, those are the copay amounts that those will amount to the 20% remaining 20% figure of the amounts in excess of the policyholder retention and your own deductible. And again, that gets divided between what the captive pays as well as what reinsurance it might have. Looks like we have a question here. Question: does a captive that only offers deductible reimbursement coverage have to do any reporting? Sounds like you said that and wasn't limited to specific lines. So if a niece captive reported in prior years by mistake, it should, hold on. Basically, no, keep report. You should, if you're got this set up where, I mean, we are looking here to what, claims the captives are going to make under the program. So in this case, yes, if this is coming in through deductible reimbursement coverage, yeah, we want you to report that in. So in this worksheet on the model loss, I mean, basically the exercise here is, you should be reporting this in a way that, you're not in a way that sort of identifies what claims are going to be made under the program. And, hopefully the carriers in other areas, maybe we'll need to specify that, but there shouldn't be, and I think that is the case. I think carriers that have these amounts, deductibles, aren't reporting those in. So yes, please keep reporting if you're generating losses that you think are generating trip claims that are within deductible reimbursement policies. You should be using those in connection with this. The scenario, just last but not least, the scenario does provide some information concerning estimated employee injuries. There is no request here for you to estimate any potential liability exposures. We have done that in some other years. However, we're only looking in this year. Please try to estimate potential property exposures under your policies as well as workers' compensation exposures. And again, think of it as, we're looking for claims that you're potentially going to be generating under the program. So if that is the case, you should be factoring that in connection with responding to this worksheet. That's all I have in terms of this general introduction. So we can respond to any further questions. Let's see, we do have one. If there are sheets that have no information, if a captive doesn't write direct terrorism policy or places of worship coverages, do we need to upload those sheets to ISO when they are even blank? Mike, look, I'm going to actually direct that question to you. I mean, I think my preference is in terms of to make sure that I mean, the issue we always have is whether, I mean, I think I'm more comfortable having carriers, enter in report forms that have zeros in them, so we know that they've looked at it and have indicated they don't have the coverage. Mike, let me know what makes sense from your standpoint.
Ideally speaking, as it relates to a data collection effort, yes, reporting the reports with zeros would be ideal. However, I'll kind of point this out. We do track what submissions and what workbooks and worksheets have been submitted. It may lead to a further inquiry on our end as it relates to potential delinquency. So on the safe side, I would suggest and recommend that companies do in fact provide the nil reports. But I'm gonna kind of hold off a little bit on to say that it would not necessarily be a bad thing unless in the fact that we have received a prior year for a particular company. So let's take, for example, place of worship worksheet. If they had reported in previous years and we did not receive one this year, that would most likely lead to an inquiry. So I think there's a few things to kind of come in mind, but what I would suggest and recommend would be to submit the nil reports.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, do that if you can. I think by doing that, you potentially avoid, as Mike says, I mean, there is some reconciliation and comparison, reports year over year. And if it looks based upon that, potentially you've forgotten a worksheet or, neglected to do it for whatever reason, we can't necessarily tell that if you didn't submit it just because, well, maybe last year you wrote a few places of worship and this year you didn't. So you just didn't submit the form. If you submit the form and put in zeros, we're in a much better position to know that, it's essentially no premium or no activity as opposed to guessing. So please do it that way. I mean, obviously, if you don't do it that way, I guess the assumption will be that you didn't write it, but you may hear from us. That's probably the best way of putting it. Any other questions?
So Richard, I did receive a question, and it's
okay.
This question is about terrorism coverage requirements. And the question is if a captive provides deductible reimbursement coverage for workers' compensation, are they required to offer terrorism coverage since the commercial policy is required to provide terrorism coverage, or can the captive choose not to include it since it's a deductible?
All right. Again, well, we're not going to give you, from the standpoint of TRIP, there are no, TRIP basically operates by virtue of what is required under state law. So if state law, under TRIP, you would be required to offer it. But unlike my understanding is, while workers' compensation is essentially it's a mandatory coverage and you can't exclude anything from it, including terrorism. I thought I've heard, and we do get reports from captives year over year with deductible reimbursement, that not every captive is providing terrorism risk insurance coverage in association with workers' compensation deductible policies. So again, if that is permitted as a matter of state law, under basically the captive insurance laws of whatever jurisdiction you're domiciled in, that's okay. From the standpoint of operating according to the program, our requirements are that the insurer offer the coverage. So if you're issuing a coverage in a TRIP eligible line of insurance and it's a workers' compensation deductible policy, from a papering standpoint, your paperwork should show that the coverage was offered and that your policyholder declined it, that would be best practices, back the law, concerning how TRIP operates. But my understanding is that it is not required by captive insurance rules for that to be covered. But again, you should check with your captive insurers. We actually, or captive departments on that. Let's see, we also have a question. Couple questions. Workers' compensation deductible reimbursement policy, a mandatory reporting line. I mean, I'm not sure what that means in this. I mean, it's mandatory. I'm actually not sure what that question means. Is it mandatory reporting? I mean, we are requesting it. If you write workers' compensation deductible reimbursement policies and you provide some terrorism risk insurance subject to the program, whether you write terrorism risk insurance in that line or not, it should be reported. If you have a reporting obligation, you should be reporting all of your TRIP eligible lines policies, and that would include, at least at this point, the deductible reimbursement policies. Also have a question back to the one about zero null forms. Don't actually have to enter a zero, since the zero goes away on the sheet. Again, Mike, I'll ask you to respond to that.
Richard, I did not see the specific question. Could you?
It's the question is, we don't actually have to input. We don't actually have to input a zero, correct? As the zero basically goes away on the sheet. I don't see what you see, so.
Okay, well, I think just submitting a blank form is what the intent of that question is, and I could be wrong. So whoever had submitted it, they could clarify that. But yes, if they do submit a blank form, so let's take, for instance, the reinsurance workbook. If they only enter the TRIP deductible amount in that appropriate line and leave the rest blank, our assumption upon receiving that would be the remaining values would be zeros. So I don't have the full details of what the question entailed. So I'll be a little limited in my response there.
Okay.
I'm more happy to if I get clarification, and whoever had submitted that, they can.
If there's any questions on what the form should look like when you send it back, I mean, on the reinsurance worksheet, just for example, if you don't have any third-party reinsurance, I mean, we would ask you report your deductible figure, as Mike noted. With no reinsurance, I think the easiest thing on that would be to, you know, even if you leave the number fields blank because there is no reinsurance, you'll see there are comment fields. The easiest thing to do would just note a comment in the first comment field. We don't purchase any third-party reinsurance, and then there won't be any issue. And otherwise, you know, if you don't have places of worship or direct or standalone terrorism coverage, you know, I think yes, you can basically submit a blank form, which I mean, we will at least know in that situation that you looked at it and had nothing to report. Any other questions before we end this? Just so again, everybody knows, I said this at the beginning, we have been recording this. Once we're done, we'll get this formatted. It will a link to the Treasury YouTube page will be basically reinserted where the link to this Zoom call was initially put, and then you or any of your colleagues would be able to go back and essentially review, if you really wanted to do that again, review what was said, or at least remind yourself what the guidance was. So with that, and in the absence of any further questions, again, thanks very much to everybody for working on this year. It is a important initiative for Treasury, and I hope important to insurers. So again, any questions, please reach out to us. And if not, we certainly look forward to receiving your responses by May 15th. And